Good evening. This is Peter Helland with the show called Israel. And tonight we have a guest, Pat Mangan. And we're not going to be talking on what you think the word Israel means. But to remind you, the show is called Israel because St. Paul, in many places in the New Testament, refers to the church as Israel. And oftentimes people lose sight of that, especially in the last couple hundred years. So what we're going to do tonight is continue on the theme of looking at terms and looking at what people are saying and finding out what the content behind that. There's a scripture we're going to look at here, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 14. That we henceforth be no more children, tossed to and fro and carried about with every doctrine by the sleight of men and cunning craftiness, whereby they lie in wait to deceive. Now, the subject tonight is, I think we subtitled it Nationalized Education, or Common Core. Pat called me about a week ago and invited me to join him with an all-day seminar at Notre Dame called Common Core. We were there the whole day, then we went to the New Morris Inn and had something to eat and had the whole day. Mm-hmm. And Pat and I go back when we were students at Notre Dame. We were in Campus Crusade for Christ and tried to hold there. Mm-hmm. And so we have fun trying to hold the line.
That's right. That's right.
And this is an issue, obviously, because you know some of my background, taking that case to the Supreme Court, and you were involved in some of the stages. Why did you call me for this? Because I didn't know about it. I mean, I used to track this. I've kind of lost touch with what's going on. You know, I go to the schools and mentor, but I don't.
You know, one of our biggest commonalities, the largest one, is our faith and our absolute belief in the truth, and the truth that sets people free, even if it makes them mad first. And this is one of those places where getting the truth about what's going to happen with the education of our most precious resource and legacy, our children, is absolutely vital. And you know, I look back at it, and you know, back in the Reagan years, where we took a pause from progressivism and liberalism, and we kind of stood back and said, you know, maybe government's getting too big. Maybe what we ought to do for education is keep the federal government completely out of it. Maybe what we ought to do is abolish the Department of Education. It's the serious, cutting-edge thinking to say, how can we keep local parents and local communities in charge of education, because they're the ones who created it. And you know, then we got into the 90s, and we got more of this progressivism, and the Clintons thought maybe what we should do is take all the private schools, all the Christian schools, all the home schools, and let's put them under the auspices and under the authority of the local school board. Well, Dr. Dobson really blew the trumpet on that and gave the alert. And we don't want even a takeover at the local level that would completely take away our liberties as believers. And so the American people shut down the congressional switchboard with concern about the liberty to educate their children as they wanted to, and not having even the local school board come and invade private schools, Christian schools, and home schools. And so, you know, then we had Bush years where you had this compassionate conservatism to say, you know, we don't want to have no child left behind. We have to have some accountability. We have to have some standards. We're going to put some carrots, and we're going to put punishments in there. And one of the themes that came out of that was something towards liberty. There's a lot of school choice programs, and we saw charter schools, and we saw an increased schooling, and something dramatic happened in between the birth of so many charter schools and taking a newer look at education, and what to be known now as Common Core. And what is driving Common Core is President Obama's program, A Race to the Top. And so
Bush's was No Child Left Behind. Obama's is A Race to the Top.
that's it. That's the big change. And there's been controversy around educational policy as long as you and I've been engaged in it. You know, remember when the Secretary of Education under Ronald Reagan said, I think we ought to have a national debate about the role of education, about the role of teachers, about the role of unions, about the role of everything. And the teachers union said to him, well, we should have that. And, you know, if we do, it's not going to go very well for you. And he said, well, I don't know, I think it's going to go fine. He said, what are you going to do, break my kneecaps? You know, I think we have got to be in a place we are free to discuss and free to explore. Right now, we still have liberties. We have to guard them. As it relates to education, and even as it relates to our society right now, we see more and more people who are turning to the government rather than to their own families, and turning to the government even rather than God.
I hate to interject here, but I have this thought, because I like to go back behind the term. Is there any reason why we can't substitute the word propaganda for education? In other words, people think that word is so nice and so sweet, you know, but, you know, I challenge that word used to, you know, why can't I argue and have and come up with a good case that it really is propaganda? You know, they go to first grade, they go to second grade, third grade. How can I be assured that it's, because they don't define the term, do they? I mean, they're going to school and they're getting educated. Is that all? And we're supposed to trust that.
Well, I mean, the real question becomes, is it education where we train our children to understand what is true about the history of the world, what is true about the history of mankind, what is true about God and eternity, and then equip them with the basis to go and engage the world and understand it and make sense of it and steward this life to produce glory and honor to God and to love one another. Now, if that's not what we're doing,
well, they might say exactly that, but they'll say that, but the way they play that out, what you just said. So you almost have to really force them to define the terms more specifically, because that's exactly what you just said and say, Pat, yeah, that's what we're doing.
Well, sure.
And then you go, wow.
That's what's happening in a real way with Common Core. By the way, they hurried this through 46 states. And the Obama administration has said, and particularly Rahm Emanuel, who's in the White House and who's now the mayor of Chicago, had said, never waste a good crisis. In other words, when a crisis happens, that's a time when you can take a forward in your social policy or your steps. So,
especially when you created the crisis, you're really prepared to handle it.
You know, what has happened and what has put power behind Common Core, and we haven't even defined what Common Core is yet, but what has put power behind this is that once the country was in economic free fall and stimulus monies were put out, when the Obama administration came in, they grabbed $7 billion stimulus funds and sent it towards basically buying states off.
No, I read
with
4.5. So,
you know, with these grants, and started driving it. That the big carrot was, if you buy into Race to the Top. Now, let me just say something about that name. Many educators said, if you started to go down the path that Obama wanted to go, this would be a race to the bottom. In other words, you would take everybody who was doing well and push them down to the mean, and that this type of a program does not allow it's not for the middle and upper middle student to really grow. This is meant to bring everybody down to a common core of learning. And so when everyone said this is going to be a race to them, they quickly coined the term a race to the top, as a polemic to try to give it a different philosophy. Now, one of the things we have to understand right now is as we're sitting in conversation, states all over America are waking up and they are saying no, they're putting the brakes on, they're getting rid of the name Common Core. Common Core has now become toxic. States are getting off the bandwagon. The Alabama legislature passed a resolution calling for the Board of Education to repeal the already adopted Common Core standards.
What's it say about our legislators and our elders of the state when they so readily adopt this stuff, oftentimes without even reading it? Who are we electing into office that would pass laws that are poisonous, and then go, oh, yeah, I guess you guys are right. We better repeal it. Well, hold it here. We can't have people like that in office because you can't always do that. Once you swallow the poison, sometimes you can't find a remedy.
We're at a point where everybody keeping me culturally, are we at a tipping point? Can we ever get back? And I ask people, what do you want to get back to? Do you want to get back to a pre-Watergate time when people trusted their government? Do you want to get back to a pre-scandal time when people lived more closely to the Bible and lived pure sexual lives? And are we going to get back to when we were more innocent as a nation? No, we can't do that. We've already passed that. We've already taken a bite out of the apple. We've already been pushed out. We can't get back there. But what we can do is, my pastor often says, if God is over there and you take steps towards God, you're going to get to God. But you can't get to God if you take steps this way. And if you find that the steps that you're taking are taking you away from God, turn around and take the steps toward God. And what we can do, what we can have, is it's not for us to take America back and to stop and think about what we're doing. Repent right now of the wrong choices we made and come back and fix it. Thank God, in Alabama, those legislators who had previous to this thinking it was one thing are seeing that it's something else. And we're seeing now in Georgia, in Maine, in South Dakota, they're all pressuring their states to drop it, to drop out completely, or at least dial back their involvement with the standards. And this is one of the things that we've seen. We heard the outrageous statement by Nancy Pelosi when people, what does this Obamacare mean? I mean, what's actually in it? 1,900 pages. What's it mean? And she said, well, we got to pass it so we can read it and see what's in it. Now, it was a quip, but the fact is that's the way that we're seeing many people approach this. Now, the way this came about is extremely important to see how it was handled, because what the Obama administration did was they took the from the stimulus money and they put it up as the carrot behind Race to the Top. And they said, if you'll do what we want to do, we'll give you some money, which is not unlike what the Bush administration did with No Child Left Behind. We'll give you some money.
It's like what they did in Wisconsin for the drinking age, because
Mm-hmm.
Wisconsin was always 18, and then they held out the money. Well, we're not going to give you money for your roads if you don't elevate it to 21. And 18, it's a cultural thing. So, it's for us to decide.
Right.
Okay. Well, if we want to go to 21, well, we'll decide that.
Mm-hmm.
But no, the federal government likes to decide things for you. And of course,
we have to remember what President Jerry Ford said. A government big enough to give you everything you want is big enough to take everything you have away from you, right? And so, what the administration did was take stimulus monies and they stimulate the states to embrace Race to the Top. And it sounded good. It sounded like, well, we want to have our children educated so that they can read on par with everyone else in the country, that there isn't too much state variation, and so that they can be on par in math and science with everybody in the country. Not only that, they use the global economy to say, we're falling behind. Well, we all know that the education's been struggling for years. We haven't talked about why, but the basic truth is it's struggling. We know here in our local region, we've seen, at times a 50% dropout rate. and I've elected officials and others, you know, if we have 50% of the 15 to 18-year-old men on the street, not prepared for work, with no gainful employment, with no future, we can't build a big enough jail because they're ready to employ them and put them to work for ill-gotten gain that comes quickly if they have no system. So really, civility in our whole society is what's at stake with education.
There's where the definition comes in handy, because Webster's dictionary on education, the word discipline is the primary meaning. It's equated to raising your children, disciplining them. And if you talk to teachers, you know, I used to quite a bit. Well, the first three main problems, the teachers will tell me this, a public school is discipline, discipline, discipline. That is their problem. Yeah, because that's what education means. So what they're telling you, screaming at us, there's no discipline occurring, there's no education occurring. But see, they can...
Well, kids are very smart, and they don't suffer fools, and they are keen. As you know from our many years in working with youth ministry, college campus ministry, and with students, if you have any hypocrisy, they're going to land on it. In a second, they're going to cut right through that. So what's happened in our school system is we went to say, like, from the founders, if we read what the founders were doing, and we read what the state constitutions say education was for,
Indiana,
it was for training in morality. Literally, we needed to be literate so that we could read and engage and drink in the scriptures, so that we could live in eternal and be that city on a hill, that our society would be that city on a hill. In our founders, many people like to debate about where they were coming from, and we hear Patrick Henry saying, "Give me liberty" or "Give me death." Yes, this is about liberty, but what we don't hear is what he said first, which was this country was founded not by religionists, but it was founded on the gospel of Jesus Christ.
But
now, that's a statement.
He also wouldn't go to the Constitutional Convention. He said, "I smell a rat." And he wouldn't go, and he said, how are you going to achieve morality without a state church? And you could argue against that, but that they offered, instead of a state church, it was a public school system. And the question is, would Patrick Henry have thought that that was sufficient? And would he have thought that in the long run it could sustain a production of morality?
You know, at the Constitutional Convention, a woman cried out to Franklin and said, you know, what's the result? What's happened? And he said, you know, we've established a republic if you can keep it. And I think Patrick Henry, along with many of the founders, would have said that the only way you can keep this is if you are absolutely covenanted to Jesus, and that you understand that the destiny of this nation is absolutely tied to God's plan through Jesus Christ here on earth. In fact, you know, we look back, and I think it's important to hear Washington and Adams said. Washington said, "Reason and experience both forbid us to think that we can have a national morality in exclusion of religious principle." So he's saying, you've got to have religious principle flooding your society, or you're not going to have any morality. And what the kids understand is this: who has the authority and the right to say what's right?
Well, yeah. How do you define the word morality? When that was put in our Constitution in 1851, it was Webster's dictionary. So the word morality, it says, the word moral refers to the law of God as the standard. But you ask anybody that's in education,
morality
they're not going to define it that way.
It's whatever seems right. It's in the scripture says that in times of broken societies, in times of broken culture, that they have no vision for the society anymore, and every man does what's right in his own eyes. And that is the absolute opposite of a moral truth that everybody buys to. In other words, one version of the scripture says this. It says, where there is no vision, the people cast off restraint. So what has happened is, as soon as you tell the kids, no, you can't, we're kind of pushing God to the side. We're not really into that God stuff anymore. Well, then they know, well, you can't make a rule for me. I mean, who said? I said, I want a different rule. And they know how to turn that back, and it's called conclusion. Now, you roll back and say, what did the founders think we were going to be doing? Well, here's what Adams said. President of the United States, one of the founders, he said, this Constitution implied all the liberties it gives was made only for a moral and religious people who are able to govern their own lives according to the 10 commandments of God. It's completely inadequate for the governance of any other such people.
I travel all over the country all the time, you know, back and forth all over. And what you see out there is not pretty. And the character, of course, I'm in a lot of like Greyhound stations, but you know, I'm all over. First of all, you could just say, if people watch 4 or 5 hours of TV, you are kind of becoming like that. I mean,
well, the scripture says, as a man thinks, so is. So we've come to understand that, you know, our identity is that we're made in the image and likeness of God. But we can change the way we think about ourselves and change the way we think about who we are by concentrating on the wrong things. And we can turn out to be very far away from who we were called to be and who we were made to be. And I know we've gotten way far afield from core, but the fact is that if Common Core
which
is if
can you give Common Core another name that would might help some people grasp what that's supposed to?
Yeah, some people are calling that math. Some people are calling it the new education.
How about nationalized education?
People are calling it nationalized information and education. And some of the groups, the groups, kind of like the Tea Party, made to say, no, we don't want a healthcare system that's going to take all our choices away and take all of our freedom away and take, you know, a big chunk of our economy and stick it under the government. Many groups are forming, and many of the groups are forming is protect local education, end the tyranny of national education.
Now at Notre Dame, it's Catholic principle of subsidiarity. Right. That was some of the things they were saying at the meeting. Everybody couldn't go in this area, but what can you say? Tell people what happened at Notre Dame.
Well, what happened at Notre Dame was respected leaders in the university, in particular from the law school,
and this was
invited.
10 days ago.
Just a short amount of time ago, invited leaders. And one of the things that's happened is when something as large as Common Core, that's going to completely change the way education works from top to bottom. I mean, literally down to kindergarten. When something that large comes, and people have tried to push it through, and it's gotten a long way before anybody's really had a chance to talk about it. The first thing is that when somebody sees how big it is, and how stealthy it's been, how sinister, how sneaky it's been, and how the fact that most of the states were forced, if you wanted the money, you had to go through an application process. And we have to understand this. What they did was they said, okay, you got to sign on to this whole Common Core, this new thing, as you make application for the money. And then by the time you get approval, you're actually embracing standards that haven't been written yet. And you're agreeing that you're to subject your students to standardized testing
that you haven't even seen.
That you haven't even seen what the goals are. So the test is becoming the statement of the goal. And everybody knows that once the standardized test, if the test changes, education will have no choice but to comply with the standards of the test. So it's in reverse. Instead of saying, here's an end product we want, now let's write standards that reflect that mission. And now let's make up a test that matches those standards. We're going the other way around. So we've had all these states agree, sort of like this, where the governor or where the legislature has said, okay, we're agreeing that we're going to take this money, and in exchange, we're going to use your testing vendor. And by the way, it's no accident that all these testing vendors, they're all in D.C. They're not even under the state's control. They're not even under the same laws, in a sense. All there, and they're away from any kind of control. But here's the really important part. All these vendors are going to get these multi-billion-dollar contracts for this testing that's going to absolutely define the life of our children. They are getting the agreement before they've ever produced a product. So it's like saying, I agree to use you at whatever price you determine for whatever product you determine to give me, because I'm being paid up front. So this is what happened. Okay. As soon as the word got out, people across the country have been sounding the alarm. And the conference at Notre Dame was to give intelligent, articulate people, professors in their specialties, trained educators in the fields of math and in the fields of actual subjects like English and literature, not just education majors who don't learn depth in a particular expertise.
They learn how to teach, but they don't learn the subject.
And some of the people who participated were actually people who were asked to be on the panels that built this whole Common Core curriculum. They were asked to be on the panels. Now, the people who came to speak, the only ones who actually had real credentials in math and English, they rejected the standards. They rejected it. They rejected the credentialing. And so they were a part of this conference. Then there were people who are passionate about education, successful educators who had established charter schools, who taught in traditional schools, who taught in private Christian universities, and who came and critiqued what Common Core is trying to do. There was even a child psychologist who came and did a critique on the fact that the Common Core, the goals were established, was they started with a goal, and so we want somebody to get here, and they just kept backing it down to the lower grades without any thought to the psychological ability of the children to meet an objective like that. So they take children who are, for example, in kindergarten, and who are creative, and they want to create things, and they're trying to get a part of their brain at evaluation and contrast comparison that doesn't really kick in until about 3 years later.
Well, I'm going to interrupt again. You remember Gary Spalding?
Yes, yes.
Well, Gary was the youth leader at Christian Center, in West, and they were sent off as missionaries, him and his wife, Mary, and for reasons, they came back. And they were going to homeschool, but they didn't use that term. They were going to do what missionaries do. They school their own kids. Came back, this is 77 or so. Well, he said, well, we're going to still do schooling as far as what we were going to do in Europe. And so I jumped on board with that. Yeah, and we got around these people up in Berrien Springs called the Hewlett Foundation, Ray and Dorothy Moore. And they had written the books that laid the foundation for this upcoming homeschooling movement. And the book that really dominated, Better Late Than Early. And people started doing PhD. I went to the guy who did a PhD at Andrews, and it was they argued there was maternal deprivation, conscious maternal, if you put your kids in a school before age 8. And public schooling, it used to start at age 8. So you just separate the child from the mother, and the idea also was exactly what you were just saying, is that you engage the child in activity when they are developmentally ready for that activity.
Right.
Okay, that was the foundation for the homeschool movement, because the public schools were going against that more and more, and now this is another radical turn.
And we have to remember that what we call public schools today were once home schools. I mean, parents really started education. Parents are the principal educator, and parents engage educators as a secondary educator. And I know a lot of listeners who may be engaged as an educator may bristle at that, but the parents still have the primary responsibility and are the primary educator, and that's what they pay their taxes to hire the school system, hire educators, to hire administrators, to hire teachers to assist them with training their children, not to take their place.
The South was really emphatic on that because they said the church should not educate and neither should the state. The people that had those children were the parents, and the parents have to take responsibility for educating, and to put it off on either the church or the state is at least questionable because who is supposed to educate? See, the word education is not really in the scripture. Is who's supposed to raise up those children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord? Who is responsible for that?
The most searing critics of Common Core, in housewife, mother, educator, got involved and started to fight this. And what she says is this, and her quote, I think is significant because she said, I'm not a conspiracy theorist and I'm not some crazed woman, but we are leading our kids right into communism. And what we're really seeing happen before our eyes is we are seeing debate from the healthy individualism to an unhealthy dependent collectivism, which is one of the things we're seeing is what states said, their charters, you cannot be a state. The country said you can't be a state unless you provide for education so that you have an educated people so that they can read the Bible and so that they can have moral formation, because a state without moral formation is going to become wicked. And
Right.
So the parents went out, they were educating their children, and then they would group together, and then the parents said, if we hired a godly school mom or a godly schoolmaster, we could get together and build a little place. And I want to tell you that my mother, through her elementary schooling, was in a one-room schoolhouse in rural Pennsylvania, and I mean each row was a grade, and there was a community around that school, but they had to walk to school in the snow. They had to do work. It was not an easy life, but they managed to get it and get training, and the training was thorough. They knew how to read. They knew how to write. They knew how to add, subtract, multiply, divide. They knew understanding of history, and they had an understanding of the panorama of the world's experience. And somehow we let collectivism, we don't call it, we went from calling it good school, and then somewhere about 30 years ago when you and I really got involved and started trying to organize, we came 300 votes short of having a simple majority on the South Bend Community School Corporation in its first elected school board. We came to call it the school corporation, the school system. That's very different than, there was no school system. I mean, there was a board and there was a superintendent, but there was a school. Mm-hmm. There wasn't, the teacher and the parents knew one another, and the parents lived close by the school because schools were built around geographic close, and they were considered neighborhood schools. And we've gone from the neighborhood school to the education factory of Race to the Top.
I'm thinking of, like, people look back on the welfare system and blame all the problems because of the welfare system. Well, hold it here. What was your arguments to bring it in? So apparently your arguments were bogus because now you want to blame people's problems on the welfare system. It seems like we do this all the time. We bring something into existence, and then we blame the very thing we bring in as the main problem.
I guess I find wisdom in Winston Churchill's statement: always does the right thing, but only after it's exhausted all the alternatives. We seem to have a problem getting it right the first time, and when we start to look for, is there another way? I think of the mountain climber, who fell down the mountain, was hanging off the mountain, and said, "Help! Help! Is there anybody up there?" And the voice came back and said, "Yes, I'm here." And, "Oh, great! Well, help me, get me off this mountain. I'll do anything you say." And he said, "Who is it?" He said, "It's God." long silence. Mountain climber yells up the mountain, "Is there anybody else up there?" Right? We don't want to do business with God. We don't want to say, "I need you, God." And yet, if we don't,
it's illegal in the schools.
Yet, if we don't say that, then we try to keep producing. And the devil is very happy to provide us with as many shiny alternatives to God that are all counterfeits as we're interested in pursuing. And he'll keep us busy with that our whole life. And so here we are. We started off with a discussion that said our education system is failing. There's no question about that.
What's it mean that it's failing?
It's failing, yeah.
How do we know? What's the sign that it's failing?
Clearly in society, we're saying it's failing. We're not graduating. Our kids don't know how to read. They don't know history.
If you're trying to
they don't understand how to do advanced math.
If you have a factory and you're trying to produce ballpoint pens, and you produce 10 pairs, but you're producing all this other stuff, I said, hold it here. You're supposed. The purpose of the Indiana Constitution, we've already said it, is number one, is to encourage by all suitable means moral improvement. That is what they're supposed to produce. You can't get any educator anywhere near to think about that. They will not think about it. I've been to meetings, I had that meeting with the superintendent in Virginia, Calvin. They had a city meeting, and I was the only one that showed up. Big, huge city meeting, and so they had to answer my questions. I kept pressing it. What are we doing about moral improvement? It says that in the Constitution. They would not answer it. They would just talk over here. That's because if you measure that, the truth is, it's like the Southerner said, it produces criminals because they're not getting disciplined. They're learning the behavior patterns of the other kids, and they're coming out.
I think about a story that Chuck Colson shared. Chuck Colson, a towering Catholic intellect Christian who came to Christ after the kind of cynicism we see in Washington today. He lived it. He was an advisor under President Nixon. He went to prison. He got through a conversion, and he didn't have just a jailhouse conversion. He came out and converted the jailhouse. He created the ministry to go back and to minister in the jails and had a fabulous voice for Christ in the system. But he was intelligent and one of the most prolific writers, articulate writers, maybe like C.S. Lewis was in the last century. And Chuck Colson was at an education summit, and he came into the table to sit down, and he was carrying his Bible, and he sat down, and one of his colleagues there, a superintendent of schools, looked at him and said, "Oh, I those Bible-believing Christians." And Chuck quickly said, "Well, I didn't know there was any other kind." And they sat down and began to talk, and he said, "Well, you're not going to like me very much." And he said, "Well, why wouldn't I like you?" And he said, "Well, I'm the person who's responsible for removing the Ten Commandments from, and I won't name the city because it would tie back to the person then, from a major city in America's public school system." And Chuck said to him, "Well, why would you do that?" And so he went down this apologist view of modern education being devoid of God and all these. And so a little later on, they were talking about the problems in school. And it reminded me when you were talking about the discipline problems, they were saying, these problems with violence and theft, it's just getting out of hand. We can't even educate. And they were going around the table saying, "Well, what would you do about it?" And the man turned to Chuck Colson and said, "What about it?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "Maybe we ought to put a sign up that says, 'Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal.'" We really, sometimes the simplest solutions are the best ones. But the truth is, if we were measuring, when you ask me what's the problem, the way that everybody's measuring right now is we can't read or write. The way we were measuring 30 years ago is we're not having faith in God come through our children. We are raising a generation of agnostics, maybe even pagans. We are raising children. We've told them, by the way, you're not special. You weren't made in the image and likeness of God. God didn't have you in his mind before he ever created you. He didn't form you in your mother's womb. And you know what? We're running out of space on this planet. There's not going to be air, and there's not going to be food, and there's not going to be all this. It's all lies. But this is what we've told them. And wonder why they look back at us and we look at their life and say, oh my gosh, they're doing all these things. Why did they embrace the philosophy, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die? We took their hope away. We took the hope of eternity that gives us the ability to live with reasonable restraint, self-restraint, not governmental restraint, not tyrannical restraint by a government who seeks more and more and more input, more and more action into our private life.
Well, they have to fill the void that they created.
So now here we are again with this massive government takeover of education. I said before we were getting ready to get rid of the Department of Education. We shut the board. Now there's a tsunami of education policy coming at our kids, coming at us. And it's coming fast, and the chance we have is we have to stop Common Core now. And this is the thing, everybody who's watching right now, you're not only going to have to learn what Common Core is, but you're going to have to learn what they're calling it. Already, just in research I did today before we came on, they're starting to call names because they know now calling this educational initiative Common Core is like calling the Unaffordable Care Act Obamacare. It's poison. It's toxic.
But
so they're starting now, exactly what you said, where they're starting to change what the terms mean.
Oh, yeah.
And this is how
it usually
cynical.
works. That's the problem.
This is how cynical it's gotten. One of the leaders who spoke at Notre Dame told us that, in fact, they had seen the same books 20 years ago. And they all got shoved in a warehouse.
I remember
and now the Common Core is that. Now they pulled them right out. They didn't even change them. It's okay, now this is Common Core. It's the same old thing that they have been trying to do. So the way this was put through with a terribly tempting carrot at a time when everybody was struggling for monies. Remember all the unfunded mandates that the federal government was pushing down to local governments? The school systems rely on local taxes. There's a limit to that too. Remember this. Our school systems are built on enrollment numbers. We fund per child. And we have to remember that we have gone through another major, the catastrophe, the 900-pound gorilla that's in the room. We have murdered 55 million babies through abortion.
Yeah,
and they are not here to go into these schools. And the enrollments are dropping, and the parent dissatisfaction is rising, and the alternatives are growing, not fast enough, but homeschooling, Christian schools.
It keeps going.
So we're seeing that if you are going to be successful in public education, you're going to have to learn how to consolidate these schools. There are going to be less students involved because they want to leave failing systems. You know, I worked with the Christian Coalition back in the 90s, and we did experiments with vouchers. And when vouchers were given in inner cities, it was interesting what happened in every case. African American families took the vouchers and created their own schools. And we saw African American students leave the public school, the inner city public school, for private Christian education when those vouchers were made available. Do that because they wanted a value system that would give a lift to a child who's otherwise going to be stuck where they are, almost like a caste system. And what Common Core does is it's lowering to a common lower objective, not raising to a common higher objective. And one of the criticisms that we heard was that not only is the educational philosophy behind this untested, but it's actually unsound. Like, for example, there were mathematicians there who said, what they're trying to do is focus on reasoning, but they're not focusing on the algorithm of how you would normally compute the math. So they take it all apart, and their credit for students who can talk their way through and give an explanation for why they added 8 and 8 and came up with 15. And if they can give a compelling argument for why they did that, they're going to get, you know, a significant amount of credit. And so that the focus is leaving just getting the answer
Well,
right,
it's
but on the process.
Postmodernism, there's no truth.
So we're looking at this and saying, wait a minute. You know, we want our kids in the process, that's great, but we want them to be able to add 8 and 8 and come up with 16. We already have a Congress and a president and a Washington that can't do multiplication or they really can't do subtraction. They can do okay, but they don't do subtraction at all. And so we're looking at this problem and saying, wait a minute, we can't have an educational system that's going to make people feel better about getting the wrong answer. We've got to stay with the algorithm that works. And if anything, we should go back to age-specific objectives. We know that sometimes boys are develop slower than girls in the early years. And if we start asking one of the speakers at the Common Core Conference said that what they described was you're going to take a room full of kindergartners and you want them to have a board meeting. You want them to compare and contrast understandings, and you want them to talk about their feelings, and they don't even know what their feelings are. They don't have the words to talk about their feelings. And then you want them to discuss alternative strategies to accomplish a goal. They're in kindergarten.
No, here to put a face on this, 'cause I think people have maybe 5 minutes left. You need to look up the guy who's called the chief architect of it, and it's a guy named David Coleman. You can look it up on the internet, but I think it's even key. This guy's only 42, but he suddenly became the chief architect, and he's your typical, Rhodes Scholar. He went through, the liberal schools, but to even track that better is to go to his mom, because his mom was president of Bennington College, and I was just talking to a friend who's sophisticated in this area. I had never heard of Bennington. I mean, he knew all about it, and but she's got a liberal track record, and her resume. I mean, every liberal group in the country, you think she's been part of it. As a psychiatrist, and they're not Christian at all. Okay, no Christian. I mean, they So his upbringing matches, and he's the one that was the architect of this, and so it's not hard to get close to who created this thing.
Well, the really key thing about him, and I saw an interview with him today, and he said the thing that should be so impressive is that we can data collection change the way people act. And he went back to the Obama election and said with data, we were able to change the behavior of the poor inner city voters based on what we could do with data. In one of the great invasions of privacy in this one, if you haven't heard anything else we said, you need to hear this. The Common Core has sold this on, we want measurement outcome. Business, we talk about that all the time, and that's a good thing. But what they want are 400 data points that the school system, that the teacher, the school nurse, everybody's going to collect on your child and keep it. What your religious views are, what your views are, who you voted for, what their training is, what they believe about issues, what they believe about sexuality, how their temperament is in class. Everything about them is being kept and put into this database. Now saying, oh, there's no central database, but they're keeping 400 data points on every child coming into this system, and it starts from 3rd to 8th grade and it carries on. So what I'm saying is this: if you haven't heard anything else, you better hear that big government is coming after your child, and they want to know 400 data points that define who your child is vis-a-vis everyone else. And based on this, Coleman, what do you think they're going to do with those data points? How do you think they're going to manipulate the testing?
Well, if you get somebody that's not a good person in office, they could just take a hold of the system, tweak it.
We're concerned about NSA listening in, and there's been a great debate about privacy on this, and they're rightfully so. And there's a case to be made for security, and there's a case that these hundreds of thousands of breaches are only 1/10 of 1% or 1/100th of 1% of what's going on. But now we're talking about empowering the school system, 400 data points, and they're going to be talking to your kids about you and their opinion of you, and they're going to collect all the information on you as a parent, and they're going to collect information on you as a home, and they're going to collect information on your children and what they believe. And they're going to use this. They're going to use this to socialize these children.
You know, I've talked to Russians. I mean, I haven't talked. I mean, on the internet, and I don't know if I met one, but basically, they're saying we're going into communism. In other words, communism was the state, or the Gestapo, the Stasi, basically, and your neighbor always turning you in. And I was just in Minneapolis, and on the buses, I see this a lot of places. You know, big thing on the bus. You know, if you see anything suspicious, you know, report any activity. And for the first time I'm on the South Shore. For the first time, somebody, you know, like a Homeland Security police guys, going just without a provocation. You know, just going through, and at the Rock, there's a security guy just going in the locker room without an apparent provocation. And the question is, are we moving toward a police state?
And that is the greatest warning that's here. You know what Common Core is. You need to learn what it is. You need to learn how vast it is. You need to learn how invasive it is. And you need to protect your children, because what we know as liberty is a great deal less than what the founders knew as liberty. And if we don't stop this right now and retake our liberty, we could lose the liberty that's been given to us by God and by those who risked everything to give us a free country.
Now you have children. I don't have children, so I can't grab this as strong as you are. But what about parents that have children and the duty of the father to protect them, or you know, and just the instinct to protect them, but also the duty? What about homeschooling? And I mean, they don't have to send their kids to public school. What do you think?
I think that there's no greater responsibility than giving our children a legacy of belief. When my son, who's graduated now, was small, we used to go to Promise Keepers gatherings. And I try to teach him to be a better child of God, a better man, a better husband, a better father, a better neighbor, a better friend, a better ambassador of the Most High God. And we have to be in a system that works with us, not against us. And if you do not have people who embrace faith and who embrace, I mean, we fought these battles. Jay Sekulow and the Christian Coalition fought these battles back in the 90s when we got the Christian clubs and we got the public school reopened to the idea that students are allowed to pursue faith, they're allowed to share faith, they're allowed to say things about faith, even though the ACLU has run a propaganda campaign against it. We've had to fight for these battles all the way down the way. And right now, your right to your child and your responsibility for what you choose about that is absolutely critical. And to think that some billionaires and some money left out of the stimulus is now having an educational system that's a juggernaut that's coming at you. If you don't get your state officials to stop this, and by the way, Governor Pence has stopped it, so let's encourage it.
Indiana is safe right now.
Well, safe because they're going to keep trying to repackage this and put it in. Now you have time to get caught up and get involved.
Okay, in the 50s, 60s, you know, atomic bomb was the scare, and this is what could happen. You had a defense.
Yes.
Okay, what's the worst case? What could happen? I mean, if we totally fail, and if that scripture verse is true, you know, by the sleight of men and cunning craftiness whereby they lie in wait to deceive. In other words, there is huge evil out there, and huge evil in D.C.
Yes.
And what's the worst case scenario?
The worst case scenario is that we're teaching our kids that their only identity is what they're good to do. And what this system, the evil of this system is that it's having people pick what they're going to do, a trade, a place of life when they're in middle school, and then train down to that. It doesn't train them to engage in higher thought and to think about the possibilities that they could be. It's training them down. And what it's really doing is the worst thing that could come from this is a small group of empowered have people with a large number of have-nots. Meaning that the income of the middle and lower
Being
has
wiped out.
stagnated and being
It's
wiped
in
out.
all the reports all
And
the
so,
time.
so the worst thing that could happen is we could now say, we're going to turn this over and we're going to run our educational system like a factory, and you have to fit some little box in there, and you're going to have your little workaday life, and it's going to be defined by
gonna-
some testing facility.
We got 1 minute.
far away.
We're going to close with a quote from Pennsylvania, Daniel Webster. And Webster did think it was the most important Supreme Court case, the Gerhard Will case, and it was a school where they're going to have no Christianity. That was the part of the will. And Webster said, you could conceive of no greater evil than an educational system that would keep out, it would damn their souls, and because they're not allowed to ask the question, who am I? Where am
Right.
I going? What's my purpose? That is what school is supposed to answer. This system is not going to allow them.
That's right.
Is that?
That's right. Jesus said this. Jesus was very kind and very merciful, but he also was angry a few times. And when he got angry, what he said was, "Woe to you who cause these little ones who believe in me to stumble. It'd be better if you'd never been born."
We got to close, but Webster, you did a lot too. So hopefully next time we'll be on, and Pat can join us in the future again and tell us what else is going on.
The alarm's been sounded.